Good morning. This is the Sharing Wheel podcast, and today we have a Latin scholar, Mike Powers. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Oh yeah, no, thanks for coming.
I don't know about scholar, but Latin passion person. I like
the
passion for Latin.
From the conversations we've had at Kid Dreams, your ability to kind of break down words and their roots and their Latin roots, and your knowledge of Greek and also Russian.
I know a little Russian,
yeah. Yeah. Now, we'll start at the beginning. And I know you teach Latin at the Clark School in Rowley.
I teach Latin. I teach Latin and classics, so sometimes I've done Roman Civ, Greek Civ, and I also teach a 6th grade vocab building class, so it's not solely Latin or Greek. We do all sorts of things. Yeah.
Fun. And so, how did you become a Latin scholar? Where did it begin?
It's called serendipity or providence, whichever word you want to choose. I'm one of 6 children, and I'm the 5th, and so my 4 elder siblings had all taken Spanish and French. I'm from Danvers, and Danvers, I must say, at least it used to. I don't know now, but Danvers used to have a very good public school system, so I was very lucky to just be born in Danvers and have a family that was committed to just doing your best. And so my 4 siblings took Spanish and French, and Latin was also an offering, but they didn't take it. So when it came to me in junior high, at Danvers Junior High, it really came out of arrogance. I said, I'm not going to do what my brothers and sisters did. I'll take Latin. It really was not because I had any particular affinity for Latin. I remember in hindsight, I guess, if I think about it, I think I liked myths, Greek myths. But it really was just good fortune. I decided to take Latin, and Mrs. Stage, who is up there in the great afterward, I loved her, and she was my teacher in Danvers Junior High. She was passionate. You did not mess with her. She was about this high, and but I didn't need to mess with her. And so because of her passion, and then just serendipitously, I seemed to really get into Latin. And there it was. It wasn't a conscious choice. And then I continued to take it. I ended up going to St. John's Prep, where I had a great experience there. In fact, I'm still very much friends with my Latin teacher that I had in high school there, who just retired a couple years ago, but I stay in touch with him. He and I would see each other twice a year or so when I came back to visit. And then when I went off to college, I was not going to do anything Latin or Greek, not because I didn't like it, but I thought I should try something different. And so I actually originally was intending to major in Russian and math. I loved math. Loved math, and then Russian I decided to take because I grew up in the Cold War. And I didn't understand why we hated these people. I couldn't understand what was it. They seemed just as human as the rest of us. But I also remember from the 1980 Olympics, their hockey team had CCCP, and I couldn't understand how that meant USSR. So there was actually a visual component to that. So anyways, I got into that, and then a friend of mine, my sophomore year at Michigan, where I went to college, asked me for help with her Latin homework. She said, you took this in high school. I said, yes, I loved it. And she said, can you help me? And I remember I can see exactly where I was sitting in my dorm room, sophomore year at Michigan, with my friend, who I'm still friends with. And I remember going, and I could remember things, certain muscle memory. This. And I just said, I remember thinking, gosh, I really miss this. It had nothing to do with not liking Russian or math. It had more just competing for my space, my time, and my energy. And after that semester, I didn't continue with Russian or math. I added Latin, and I was at the upper levels of Latin because I had done so much in high school. And I started formally ancient Greek, and and here we are now, many years later.
So you came out with a degree in Latin?
At Michigan they called it classical languages and literature. So it was it's the study of the ancient Mediterranean cultures, but from a linguistic starting point rather than archaeological. And we did have to take some archaeology, we did have to take some history, but the main thrust was, let's look at it from the language point of view, and then you can branch out into the other parts of the culture.
Right, right. Now, is that something you use in the classroom today as a way of getting into the history of
I do.
Rome
Yes, I mean, all sorts of things come back to me. I am such a words person. That's just because whether it's my brain chemistry or I had very supportive parents who felt that education was valuable, and I had very good teachers who had a passion for it. But the obvious thing that my Velcro was for words. It's not that I didn't like other things, but so. My way into things is always either words or food, because I love food. So yes, it's a long answer to when I'm doing stuff with Rome or Greece, a lot of times I'll say, well, this is what they called this, or this is the name of their god for whatever.
Right.
Have you ever thought about your name probably means something? Do we know what the name of this god means, or why they use that word? What does that word mean?
Yeah.
And so very often I get into things almost obliquely,
right,
instead of directly.
And the food is the same way.
Oh gosh,
you're right. Portals into history and culture, and for sure. And you're also a baker. As well, right?
Well, I would call myself a baker in aspiration, but I'm more of a voyeur. I love watching people who do bake, and I happen to work at a bakery on weekends, and in the summer I work there more days. Fantastic bakery in Salisbury called Anna Rose's, and I love food and good straightforward ingredients, and nothing complicated, but done well by people. And so yes, that's my passions are Latin, Greek, and food, and especially baked goods.
What's nice about today and how it kind of worked out, Delphine's is next door.
Yes.
And they have excellent food. And this is your first time?
This is the first time I'd been to Delphine's, just quickly checking with you before we came here. So I think I might be going there after this.
Actually, you didn't get a chance to actually eat because we were chatting.
No, it's all good.
Meeting friends. So that's fantastic how a teacher influences a young person's life, so cool. And now fast forward, you're doing the same thing at Clark.
I'm lucky. I'm lucky to have a job a place where, first of all, offers Latin, but also I love my colleagues. They're just good, amazing people, really, who will never get, quote, press time.
Right.
But they're just amazing because the students we have at Clark come with a lot of different learning approaches, and so it involves a lot of my learning from my colleagues about how I can best help my students. And so I've got a great supportive fellow staff, and the head of the school supports my doing Latin. And I'm very lucky.
Fantastic. And so tell me why Latin is not a dead language.
Oh yeah. You want to get?
I'm playing the devil's advocate.
Want to get my Irish roots, my Irish temper going. I confess that. I get my dander up, or I get my feathers ruffled and all that. With that, and one might say, well, of course you're a Latin teacher. Of course you are going to defend it. But actually, I will say I get my dander up because it's actually a misuse of language. And as a language teacher, I find there's a certain something about that I immediately think it's because we're not paying attention to the language we're using. And so I don't mean to blame people who say, oh, you teach a dead language, because unless their intention is ill will, which it usually isn't. It's just they're looking to converse with me. And for them, because it is not something they see on signs and things like that, or heard communicated in voice, the word for it is dead. So fair enough. But if I have a second with the person, if they seem to be invested in a conversation, actually would say, the word you might want is to change it to something like, the Latin I teach is no longer currently used, but Latin as a language is to say it's dead is wrong, because it's called French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Occitan. It's all the modern Romance languages. It's the same language.
Yes.
But just as we do, languages develop and change. So I would give the analogy of, we know that Beowulf is English, and so Shakespeare, and so is Chaucer, if you've ever read the Canterbury Tales. But we don't speak that way anymore. But we wouldn't say that Beowulf, or we wouldn't say that English is dead.
Right. Yeah.
It's not. It's now way we speak it here, but of course, if you go to South Africa, where your wife Michelle is from, you might hear slightly different terms. Or if I go to Scotland, I might hear. But it's still English. So to say Latin is dead, that really is analogous to saying, well, English is dead, just because we don't speak it the way Beowulf's author did. And so I would say that's just the wrong word. The word is that the Latin that I and most schools that teach Latin are teaching is, yes, a Latin of a previous time period. But Latin is not that. There's hundreds of millions of speakers of it now. It's just we call them by their more local names: Spanish, French, Italian.
Right, right. And even like common Latin terms in our own.
There's quite a few, right?
We spoke a little earlier, like excuse me, bona fide.
Yeah, we say, and what's interesting is that we pronounce things differently because things again get pronounced differently. But in Latin, it's actually would have been bona fide.
Okay.
Bona fide, but because of the huge influence of French upon English, thank you, Battle of Hastings, 1066, and the Norman invaders bringing in their Latin-based language.
Right.
We now get a lot of silent letters, so we think of it as a silent e, but fine, we'd say bona fide, but it really is bona fide. Bona fide,
And alter ego.
Alter ego, it literally means another I, another I.
Ad nauseum.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Which is
that one's fun because that has two different paths, because ad nauseam is Latin, but Romans, even what one would say illiterate ones, which there were many illiterate Romans because language, teaching writing was not as common.
Right.
Most of them would have been bilingual with Greek, and I say that shouldn't be remarkable because many of us here are decently bilingual with Spanish, but we just never think about it. So we say tortilla, burrito, or that's Spanish.
Sure.
So the Romans would knew a lot of Greek, but they of course made it their own. So nauseam is actually Greek. Nous in Greek means ship. So ad nauseam literally means to the sickness you feel on a ship. In other words, to seasickness.
So
it's originally Greek.
But
then the Romans have it, and then and then I'm going on right now ad nauseum about the phrase ad nauseum. So there we go.
It's a wonderful thing, and that's and I was circling back to where I met you at Kid Dreams Coffee Shop, and sort of speaking with you and the conversations that we've had, and part of this podcast is taking conversations that occur in the coffee shop and then bringing them over to BevCam to expand upon, Right. And but I love the how you have the ability to break down a word and also, give a history behind it, and where the word, and this comes up a lot in the conversations that I've had with people, the word becomes sort of a portal into, Greek history or Roman history, or, I mentioned that we did an interview on the banjo.
Yeah.
And, you wouldn't think, you just think of, bluegrass music, banjo, but it had such a unique history back to the minstrel show, back to West Africa, a gourd attached to a stick, and a thumb string. So these, it's just fascinating where if you stop and think about the origins of words or things in the culture, it actually opens up worlds, But if you're kind of siloed, and even me, and I'm siloed too, I'm trying to get unsiloed,
We all are.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. And so, like other words like per capita, de facto.
De facto, yeah. These are all Latin. Or even there's things that are so embedded in our language we actually, fair enough. Why would we think about it? That are Latin, like right now, this is the morning. Yeah. And so if you want to be very specific, what time is it? 10, whatever, a.m. Well, a.m. is Latin. It's not English. If you unpack the a.m. it's ante meridium, which means before meridium. Meri means middle, and diem is day, before midday. And then p.m. is post meridium, after midday. So, or before noon and afternoon. Right. But we don't even, fair enough. We don't think about that. It's Latin.
You're right. Exactly. Yeah. So it's like here is Latin, like hidden in plain sight,
right
but we're
there.
Unaware of it. You know.
Right.
And that what's great about this conversation and what you do is that you awaken people to that.
Well, and it's because the truth is I hope I don't come off pedantic. It's more I'm sharing my own joy in myself realizing it. I don't know when I realized AM and PM were Latin. It was probably in Mrs. Stage's junior high class, but if you think about it, I would have seen and used that AM and PM for 12 years before I suddenly realized what it was all about. So it's more about there's a joy in saying, do you realize, did you ever think about this?
Right.
And then you share that joy with people, and maybe they don't have the same level of joy, but the idea is
it's interesting.
Good to just know.
Just there's Latin in your everyday life.
Something there, right?
It's actually there's a lot of Latin around, right? And because the days of the week are also Latin based.
Well, so it's a little bit. So if I can, let me pan out and let's say the months of the year. Let's start with that.
Right.
Those are. We took them straight from Latin, and we just again pronounced them with a modern pronunciation because languages develop just as, or even people would say languages get shaped by the linguistic winds, just like land shapes get shaped by friction of currents and all that. So we say December, for example. That's a Latin month. It would have been pronounced December. But it's the same letters. We, in fact, by the way, we use the Roman alphabet. We're using their alphabet. We still use. They had all those 12 months. We're still using them.
And they were adjectives.
They were adjectives. Right. So we might say on the 5th of December, the Romans. First of all, they don't have 31. They don't count the days in the same way. They don't reckon them in the same way. They have the same number of days that we do, but they reckon them in a different way. But they would have said, so for example, coming up next Saturday is the 15th of March, which is actually the Ides, what we call the Ides. And anyone who knows their Shakespeare or they know their history, they know that this is there's a famous Ides of March on 44 BC when Caesar was assassinated.
Right.
And we say Ides of March, but in Latin, they would have said the March Ides.
Okay.
Just like we would have said the sunny Ides or the dark Ides or the chilly Ides. They don't say of. So months were originally adjectives, and we still use them the same months that the Romans have. Again, we just designate days within it in a different way. And so all of your months are straight from Latin. So again, they would have said Februarius, we now say February.
Okay.
And this month would have been Martius. But we now, because of, again, from the influence of French, you soften things and because March, and all that. But they're all the same Roman months.
And March was the beginning.
It was originally the first month of the Roman year. It really was for the first. So Rome is traditionally, they saw themselves founded around 753 BC, and actually the archaeological record supports that. It seems to be the first settlement in the sense of settle, as opposed to people coming and going. It does seem to date, the material culture dates it to right around 750 BC.
Right.
So the Romans had March as their first month until the 130s BC, when they actually moved the beginning of the year back to the month January. Right. They already had a month January named after their god Janus, who is the god of gates and doorways and things. But they moved it back because they had they had to get their elected officials, who were also their generals, out to the field of war. And what happened was that war would start in March. That was when it was warm enough to start. It was like a baseball
campaign
season. You had war season.
Yeah.
And but the problem was, as they expanded their control, they had control in modern day Spain and Portugal. And by the time their elected officials got there in March, they got there in mid-March,
Right.
which meant that the armies based there were already getting kind of battered because they didn't have their leadership there.
Right.
The Romans said,
Yeah.
we need to get our leaders there earlier. So they said, let's
Okay.
make the first of the year, in other words, when our elected officials start their duty,
Yeah.
January.
Okay.
And so that's why for us, January is the first month and not March.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Like, again, right? Like that's
And I don't
you
remember
know,
when I found that out, but I
yeah,
remember when
yeah,
I found
yeah,
that
it's
out,
like-
I thought,
Yeah.
how,
yeah,
whoa.
Yeah. And
Who knew?
yeah. No, it's yeah. Just the idea of calendars and the what's it? The Gregorian.
I believe, unless it's been tweaked since, but as I understand, we use what's called the Gregorian calendar, which was commissioned under Pope Gregory.
Okay.
But Pope Gregory, the Gregorian calendar is just a slight tweak, and I wish this is where I'd have to look up again exactly how, but it's a slight tweaking of Julius Caesar's calendar, the Caesarian calendar.
Okay.
So we're just one tweak away from the calendar that Julius Caesar was
Right.
using,
Yeah.
and the Emperor Augustus, right,
Yeah.
the first Roman emperor.
Yeah.
We're just one tweak away from what they had, and I
Right.
can't think of what the tweak is.
Yeah. So it's amazing, like these moments in history where things shift, a calendar shifts, or these points in times where in history where you just
It's almost like you don't realize how intentional or momentous they are because they're so part of our daily lives.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just like
And-
I don't think about
yeah.
turning on my light in the morning when I have to think about this is something that most of human history you got up and you had to deal with sunlight or you had to light something on fire. So there's so many things with language we just don't think about because in some ways we're busy, but also it's so embedded in our world that you forget to think about it.
Right. And when you do think about it, like things shift in your in your thinking, you know, and it kind of makes you go, well, what else about the history, you know, is similar, you know, and
it's like
a
asking
discovery,
someone.
you know.
It's like asking someone about their family history. It really is. You're asking the ethnicity of a word, and sometimes there are fascinating and sometimes scandalous or scurrilous things about a word that you never would have realized unless you start asking.
There's a lot of languaging like came out of slavery.
Or the modern Romance languages. A lot of their words are using they would call vulgar Latin, which doesn't mean what we think of it. Vulgar just means the language of the everyday people. The everyday people. It had nothing to do with being coarse or inappropriate. It really just meant the everyday people. So you start realizing, well, if you're saying that the classical Latin, the Julius Caesar Latin word for horse is equus. And we get our word equestrian and all that. But someone might say, well, I took Spanish, and the word for horse is caballo. Why? Well, it's because actually the everyday word, a Roman of the everyday wouldn't walk around saying equus. That's like me walking around saying, I brought my steed to the saloon. You'd say, I brought my horse or my nag. So caballo comes from caballus in Latin, which is the everyday word for a mousy-haired nag that most people, if they had a horse, that's what they had. They didn't have a steed. So that's why you don't hear a lot of equa words in the modern Latin languages because no one speaking them would have been using them. They'd be reading about them. But so there's so many words that come from vulgar, but really the vulgar meaning the everyday Latin, not coarse or inappropriate Latin.
And it's this might be another episode which we've kind of touched upon. Is this how words develop? You know. And that's a whole nother.
You mean how they pronounced, or
Well,
how
just
their
like,
meanings changed?
how they originate.
Yeah,
You know,
well, yeah.
the origins of words.
Right.
You know, when you're describing reality. You know, and
Yeah,
and
right.
then when the words develop, and then, you know, fast forward, we're using words without thinking about them necessarily,
Right.
but communicating. And then if you go back to the origin of it, you know, like, why is a rock?
Yeah,
You know,
right.
It's like,
Right.
So it's just fascinating.
Well,
you know?
and why is it rock to some people? And it's you know, rocco and all that. But in Latin, it's saxon. I mean, it's a completely different sound.
Yeah.
And you know, so why is it that certain groups of people chose a certain sound? Why is it that they chose to use their windpipe and their tongue and
Right, yeah.
It gets
Right, you get
explodes your brain sometimes trying to think about
And some of
the
the
very
mo-
fact that you and I are sitting here communicating with one another, and that there's people who are listening to this who can understand us. In some ways, that is a miracle.
Yeah,
an
I
absolute
agree.
miracle.
Agreed. Yeah. It's and that's another thing where you don't think about. You just take it on faith that, you know,
Right.
words come out, but the process, all the processes that take place neurologically, and, you know,
Right.
formulating the word, articulating the word, the tongue, you know, speaking it, and then having it perceived,
Right.
and, you know, and processed, and then you respond, and just like, yeah, miraculous, really.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, really, really fascinating. And these are some of the conversations that you and I
Right.
have
Outside,
had at the coffee shop.
In and outside Kid Dream. When it's nice out, we're outside. And
Right,
when it's
right, yeah.
chilly like today, we're inside. But Kid Dream is a good incubation place.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
well as Delphines would certainly be, or
yeah, sure.
Atomic. Or
Yeah. No, it's what I love about coffee shops is, like, things like this can happen, you know. And the coffee helps, you know.
No,
the cup of coffee.
No, it really
you know,
does help. I mean, I mean, you can't take away the fact that you've been given an elixir that
Yeah.
really just stimulates and opens up your
Yep.
brain, and so it's its own medium that has as its maybe not intended offshoot of suddenly you've got thoughts flowing and people talking and
Right. And then, you know, you bring back. Apparently, the origins of coffee is when in Ethiopia, when the goats were eating the berry or the
kava, right? And
you know, and
they get a little hyper.
Yeah.
People are like, "What's?
So we can thank
I want what they're having." And
So and then and then the history of coffee, right, where it you know, Ethiopia, and then getting into you know, into Turkey, where it was suppressed because it people have conversations, people communicate, people, the brain stimulated, you know, and that was a threat to the order of that time, you know. And
I hope we're not coming back to that, but yeah.
And then England, they used to call the coffee shops like a penny university.
Oh, right,
you know.
right, that's right.
And I think actually, like, even like the idea of newspapers originated out of the coffee shop.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
But yeah, and then, you know, we get places like Boston Latin, which is the oldest high school, I think.
I believe it's
right?
the oldest. I believe it's the
Yeah.
oldest public school in the country. I believe it is.
Yeah. And they taught like Greek and Latin, so that was very much like early America.
That's what, if
how
you were
everyone-
educated, as I understood in the West at least, if you were educated, you knew Latin and probably Greek, but definitely Latin. I mean, Shakespeare definitely knew Latin. But as far as I understand it, again, and it sounds elitist in hindsight, but at the time I don't think it was intended to be elitist. But the idea is, if you were lucky enough to go to school, you were taught classics, at least Latin, but probably some Greek.
Yeah.
And that persisted, as far as I understand, in many communities in this country through World War I, and if not after it.
Right.
But I feel like World War I is, if one has to put an arbitrary date of where that stopped being
the drop-off
as common,
Yeah.
seems to be right around then. But I've not done a detailed story, but we certainly don't have it in the same way, unfortunately.
Right. And
Well, unfortunately, from my point of view, from now, but there still are quite a few communities that offer Latin.
Right, and then in the Northeast, you mentioned Virginia is.
The state of Virginia and the New England states are still the bastion of Latin and classical education. Not to say that other states. I lived and worked in Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan, for 20 years, and they had Latin there. But if you did, where is it most concentrated? Where is it most offered? And where does it seem to have the most vigorous community? It's still the New England states in Virginia.
Yeah.
But if you think about that, one might, I don't know if it's tendentious, but you think about those are the two major pinpoints of where European settlers started, right? New England,
right,
with the people down in Plymouth, and then up here in this area, and then in Virginia. So it might be just because of that, it might have almost has more of an anchor, but that could be be fanciful. It might be just happenstance that New England and Virginia still happen to have the strongest. But it doesn't mean to say that things aren't coming back. For example, I'm not sure of right now the current state of classics in Latin, for example, in like California, which is the most populous state and which has a lot more Hispanic speakers, and of course that's modern Latin is Spanish. And then there are especially if you're Christian, but not exclusively, but definitely if you're Christian, you might have an interest in Latin, especially because it was the language of the Catholic Church. Well, it still is,
right up until
the Vatican II, 1960s, where they said at least the services should be in the vernacular.
Right.
But it still is the official language. So. There might be resurgences I'm just not aware of. I confess I have not been able to go to any of my national and regional organizations conferences in some years, partly because of the pandemic, and then sometimes they meet when I'm in the middle of my school year. But it would be interesting thing to go down for me is to see what are our statistics about how is Latin doing.
Yeah,
definitely it's still around in this area.
Absolutely, and it's and I think it's conversations like these that could rekindle the interest in Latin. Right. Certainly, my interest in Latin, because I didn't take Latin; I took Spanish, and so you're my Latin teacher.
And I'm learning every day, and I learn because I have resources I can go to. But the truth is, I learn by having conversations. People ask me questions, or as I'm talking to someone about something that I feel I know, I suddenly realize, oh, there's more I don't know about this, and so I'm never gonna stop learning, but it helps. It does help. It's fun to share. I can spend many a day, as you saw me at the outside Kid Dream. Right. I'm reading my Latin. It's a very lovely thing to do myself. But the truth is, that has an end point when you can't share it. So. Yeah,
and that's we spoke of Latin clubs. The Boston Active Latin.
There are. You certainly have your own. Some Latin teachers, for example, I taught for a little bit right when I first moved back here in the pandemic. I was teaching down in Braintree at Thayer Academy, which is a fantastic school, by the way.
Yep.
And then I also did a semester at Dana Hall in Wellesley, another fantastic school. And I can say that some of my Latin colleagues, they teach Latin, they're nice big Latin programs. They themselves get together in the summer and read or discuss Latin. So there's small communities, but then there's also something called the Conventiculum Bostoniense. It's run through UMass Boston. Conventiculum means the little gathering, right? The little convention, the little gathering, Bostoniense, the Boston gathering. But it is where people get together and they do I think it's a week long, though. I confess I need to look this up for this year. But they usually do some sort of week-long program in the summer where people actually speak it. Classical Latin. So the idea is to communicate with one another only in Latin. Yeah. But they also do other outreaches and reading groups and promotion. I'm not part of it, again, not because I don't want to. The truth is I haven't picked my head up from the weeds to investigate more. So I have things I should be doing soon.
But it's nice that these clubs exist so people can actually engage in Latin.
Right. And it gets other people interested. Sometimes some people might not be interested in Latin, for example, because they don't hear it. We are a musical sound-based, those of us who aren't who have our hearing. Some people are not lucky to have hearing, but we are very attuned to sound. So some people might get more interested in Latin if they realize there's a place to actually try to speak it and hear it, rather than just reading it.
Sure. Well, Mike, I think you've proven that Latin's not dead.
I hope it's not.
In the least.
No, it's not to
so
me.
That's,
and,
that statement is out the window.
And if anyone's interested in learning more, well, contact Sean and he'll put them in contact with me.
Yeah, sure.
I just would tell people, there's tons out there.
And how would someone get in contact with you?
They certainly can. I mean, I can give them my email.
Is that okay to do on
I
air?
can give it to you. Yeah,
okay,
I can.
Sure.
It's so it's my name and a number. So it's michael.powers.89. So it's michael.powers.89 @gmail.com.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it would help in the subject line if you just say Latin interest or something.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I also have a school email, but I won't give you that. But just I get.
Okay.
I would love to hear
someone's
people,
interested in talking
if they're interested in talking more, or if they want to learn something. I do tutor. I tutor in person. I also tutor remotely. I have a student in Michigan actually right now that I tutor twice a week.
No kidding. Oh, wow.
It's really fun. And I know how to share screens and share documents, and we do an hour-long session, so
great.
I love it.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, but this has been wonderful. I really appreciate this.
Very much enjoyed it, Mike, and we'll have to pick up this thread again.
I'm gladly. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you all.
Thank you.